Ever catch yourself doing something completely automatically, like driving home and suddenly realizing you don't remember the last few miles?
Oh, definitely.
Or maybe reaching for that second cup of coffee even though you know you're already buzzing.
Hmm.
These ingrained habits, these automatic behaviors, they really shape our days, don't they? They have a surprising amount of influence.
They truly do.
Yeah.
I mean, our lives are just sort of woven with these habitual actions, right?
Yep.
Many running beneath the surface of our conscious awareness.
Yeah.
And understanding the science behind how these habits form and, crucially, how we can reshape them is, well, it's not just interesting, it's incredibly empowering.
Which brings us right to today's deep dive. We've sifted through that fascinating collection of sources you shared on the science of habit formation and change.
Right.
And we're talking everything from, the intricate workings of the brain to real-world applications in marketing, business strategies, even social movements.
Yeah, it's a broad scope. And our goal today is to really pull out the most valuable insights from this material for you.
Mm.
We want to not only understand what's happening in our brains when habits take hold, but also, equip you with practical knowledge on how to navigate and modify these patterns.
And hopefully without getting totally bogged down in the really complex details.
Exactly. Keep it actionable.
Okay, so one of the foundational ideas that keeps coming up again and again is this concept of the habit loop. Let's maybe unpack that first. What are the core pieces here?
Sure. So, at its heart, the habit loop is basically a three-part neurological sequence.
Mm-hmm.
First, you've got the cue. That acts as a trigger, telling your brain to kick off a behavior.
Okay, the cue. Got it.
Then comes the routine. That's the behavior itself, could be physical, mental, even emotional.
Right.
And finally, there's the reward. That's the positive bit your brain gets after the routine, which strengthens the link between the cue and the routine. Makes you want to do it again.
And that experiment with Julio the monkey and those colored shapes, that's such a vivid illustration of this loop in action, isn't it?
Absolutely. So researchers showed monkeys different shapes on a screen. Those are the cues.
Mm-hmm.
When Julio saw a specific shape, he learned that doing a certain routine, like pressing a lever,
Right. The action.
would lead to a pretty nice reward,
Yeah.
a squirt of blackberry juice.
Yeah. Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting, I thought. They were tracking Julio's brain activity, right?
They were. And they found that as the habit got stronger, his brain started firing up in anticipation of that reward before he even got the juice.
So not when he got the juice, but when he saw the shape.
Exactly. Initially, yeah, a big brain buzz happened when he tasted the juice. But as the habit became automatic, that spike shifted forward. His brain lit up with excitement the moment he saw the cue.
Wow.
And this anticipation, this craving for the reward, that becomes the real engine driving the habit loop. It's not just about getting the reward, it's the expectation.
It really makes you think about, like, phone notifications, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You get that buzz or ping, the cue, and even if you don't know what it is, there's that immediate urge to check, that anticipation of maybe something interesting waiting.
Precisely. Our brains learn that the notification cue often leads to some reward, maybe social connection, maybe information, maybe just novelty. And that craving kicks in instantly.
So this basic loop cue reward has been used super effectively, sometimes without even realizing it, in things like marketing.
Oh, incredibly effectively. Think about the early days of Pepsodent toothpaste.
Ah, yes. The whole campaign built around tooth film.
Exactly. The advertising guy, Claude Hopkins, he identified this common feeling, that slightly fuzzy sensation on your teeth. He called it tooth film, made that the cue.
Even though it's not really harmful or anything.
Right. But he framed it as the cue. Then he clearly laid out the reward. A beautiful, bright smile.
So he linked the feeling to the desired outcome.
He did, and positioned Pepsodent as the routine to get there. That simple habit loop he engineered, it turned Pepsodent into a huge success. And the key insight, I think, is that sometimes just creating awareness of a cue and strongly linking it to a desirable reward can be enough to build a really powerful habit.
So it's that neurological pull, that craving for the reward you expect, that keeps these loops going strong.
That's it. Without expecting that positive reinforcement, the cue and routine alone often aren't enough to make a habit stick, to make it automatic. It's the underlying desire, the neurological yearning that makes us repeat it almost without thinking.
Okay, now let's dive a bit deeper into the the hardware side, the brain itself. Where are these habits actually living? The basal ganglia keeps coming up.
Yes, the basal ganglia, it's a pretty ancient part of the brain deep
Yeah.
inside, and it plays a critical role in forming and storing habits.
Okay.
There were these studies with rats in mazes. Researchers watched their brain activity as they learned the route.
Right.
Initially, lots of brain activity everywhere.
Right.
They're actively figuring things out. But once they learned the maze, once it became a habit,
Mm-hmm.
overall brain activity went down.
Less thinking needed.
Exactly. But activity in the basal ganglia, it spiked.
So it's almost like the basal ganglia just takes over, puts the routine on autopilot, freeing up the rest of the brain for other stuff.
That's a really good way to put it. The basal ganglia encodes these learned sequences, makes them automatic. And that frees up our, limited cognitive resources for other decisions, other problems.
Yeah, imagine if you had to consciously think about every single step of tying your shoes every morning.
Or brushing your teeth. Your brain would be
Okay.
just completely overwhelmed. So the efficiency we get from these habit loops stored in the basal ganglia is essential.
It's almost a bit mind-blowing thinking how much of what we do is just running on this subconscious program.
Mhm.
And then there's the incredible case of Eugene, the amnesiac. His story just throws this huge spotlight on how habits can exist completely separate from conscious memory.
Eugene Plauty, yeah. He had severe brain damage, couldn't form new declarative memories,
Mm.
facts, events, things we consciously recall.
Right, he couldn't remember conversations minutes later.
Couldn't remember conversations, couldn't recognize people he just met. But remarkably, he could still learn and perform new habits.
Like his daily walks.
Exactly. He'd take the same walk every day, find his way back home, but have zero conscious memory of the route. He could find the kitchen to get nuts,
Uh-huh.
even though he couldn't tell you where the kitchen was or how he learned to find it.
That's just wild. So even though his conscious mind didn't remember learning it, his basal ganglia somehow had encoded these habitual behaviors. His body knew what to do.
Precisely. There was this telling experiment where researchers gave him objects to sort. Outside his familiar routine, the objects meant nothing to him.
Hmm.
He couldn't even explain why he instinctively turned one over, just said something like, "That's just a habit, I think." It really shows that habits operate on a different neurological track, one that doesn't need the conscious memory bits of the brain. It's a whole other kind of learning.
And it wasn't just physical routines, was it? There were hints of emotional habits, too, persisting even when the memory trigger was gone.
Yes, that's right. His emotional responses could become habitual. His daughter noticed that even though he'd quickly forget their chats, he'd still seem frustrated or sad when she left.
Why?
Because the emotional pattern, expecting her to still be there, had somehow been established. Even after the conscious memory of her visit faded, it just highlights how deep habits run actions, emotions, often totally below our awareness.
Okay, all of this really hammers home how much we're guided by these automatic patterns. Now, shifting gears slightly, the idea of keystone habits also came up a lot in the sources. What makes a habit a keystone?
Keystone habits are, well, they're like the lead domino. They're foundational habits that tend to set off a chain reaction of other positive changes in different parts of our lives.
Okay.
They create structures, even cultures, that make other good habits more likely to take root. Lisa's story, the woman who quit smoking, is a powerful example.
Right, she had that moment trying to light a pen instead of a cigarette, a real wake-up call. But it was deciding to do that desert trek that became her focus, right? And quitting smoking was just part of making that happen.
Exactly. By focusing intensely on that one habit, quitting smoking, specifically to enable the trek, she unintentionally kicked off this cascade of other positive shifts.
Like what?
She started exercising for stamina, which led to eating better, sleeping better,
Mm-hmm.
and eventually it even played a part in her going back to school, buying a house, getting engaged.
Wow, quite the ripple effect.
It really was. And scientists saw her brain activity actually changing, these new behaviors rewiring things, overriding the old smoking pathways. It wasn't just stopping one thing, it was starting a transformation by tackling that central keystone habit.
So consciously focusing on one big change can unexpectedly ripple out into totally different parts of your life. That's fascinating.
It is. And keystone habits aren't just for individuals. They can shape the cultures within organizations too. The example of the West Point cadets doing those morning check-ins is a good one.
Ah, yeah, the Musketeers group, right? Making it a daily ritual to connect and support each other.
That daily gathering, that simple routine of mutual support, it became a keystone habit. It fostered resilience, trust, shared purpose among those cadets.
Hmm.
It gave them the strength they needed for the pressures of West Point, embedding those values and shaping their leadership later on.
And then there's the idea that small wins are linked to these keystone habits, like Michael Phelps and his meticulous pre-race routines,
Yeah.
visualization, relaxation.
Precisely. Bob Bowman, his coach, he understood the power of establishing these core, seemingly small routines. These small wins, these consistent moments of mental prep, successful execution, they built this foundation of confidence and control.
That went beyond just the race itself.
Oh, far beyond. It influenced his diet, training, sleep. Everything became more aligned with his main goal. These small, consistent successes act like little experiments, showing you resources you didn't know you had, fueling bigger changes. It's about building momentum through small victories, anchored around a keystone habit.
Okay, so keystone habits can be incredibly powerful for widespread change. But what about those, bad habits we're actually trying to break? The sources kept mentioning the golden rule of habit change. What's the core idea there?
The golden rule is essentially this. You can't extinguish a bad habit, you can only change it.
You can't just delete it.
Nope. The neurological pathways for that habit, they're already built in your brain.
Yeah.
Trying to just suppress it or eliminate it completely is often, it just leads to frustration and relapse.
Okay, so if we can't just stop doing something, how do we change it? What's the process?
The key is to figure out the cue that triggers the unwanted habit and the reward your brain is chasing.
Cue and reward again.
Always. Once you understand that underlying loop, you can consciously slot in a new, better routine in the middle. You keep the same cue, aim for the same reward your brain craves, but you swap out the problem behavior for a new one.
The Tony Dungy coaching example with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers really brings this to life, especially in that high-pressure football setting.
Absolutely. Dungy saw that under game pressure, players would revert to old, sometimes ineffective habits. His approach wasn't to erase those instincts.
No.
No, it was to drill new, more effective routines so thoroughly that those became the automatic response to the same game day cues. He overwrote the old routine with a stronger, better one, so they could react instinctively but successfully.
Makes sense. And Mandy's nail-biting habit. That's maybe a more personal, relatable example of this rule.
Mandy worked with a psychologist using something called habit reversal training. First, they figured out her cue. Usually a feeling of tension in her fingers or noticing a rough edge on a nail.
Okay.
The routine, obviously, was biting her nails. To change it, she learned a new routine, a competing response to do whenever she felt that cue.
Like what?
Like rubbing her fingertips together or clenching her fist or squeezing a stress ball, something incompatible with nail biting.
Ah, I see.
By keeping the underlying need, probably some kind of sensory stimulation, the likely reward in the initial cue, but consciously replacing the destructive action with a constructive one, she gradually broke the habit.
So it really boils down to finding a substitute behavior that scratches the same itch, satisfies the same underlying craving the old habit did.
Exactly. You're essentially rerouting the habit loop, giving your brain a different, more acceptable path to get the reward it expects when the cue shows up.
Yeah, willpower. That seems like it should be central to changing habits, but the sources suggest it's not this bottomless well we can just keep dipping into.
That's a really crucial point. Research strongly suggests willpower works more like a muscle. It gets tired with use.
Like physically tired.
Mentally fatigued, yeah. The classic cookie and radish experiment is a great illustration.
Right, remind us how that one went.
Okay, so participants came into a lab smelling freshly baked cookies. Tempting, right?
Very.
One group got to eat the cookies. The other poor group had to resist the cookies and eat radishes instead.
Oh, radishes.
Exactly. Afterwards, both groups were given a really difficult, frustrating puzzle to solve. And the researchers found that the students who'd used willpower to resist the cookies, they gave up on the puzzle much faster.
So resisting the cookies actually drained their mental energy, their willpower muscle.
That's the interpretation. It left them with less capacity to persevere on the hard puzzle. It shows willpower is finite. It can be depleted by self-control.
Okay, but the good news is, like a muscle, it can be strengthened.
It can, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly through establishing and practicing keystone habits. Studies show that things like regular exercise or consistently monitoring your finances can actually improve your overall self-regulation capacity in other areas too.
Interesting. And it seems like planning ahead, this idea of implementation intentions, can be a smart way to conserve willpower.
Absolutely. Implementation intentions are basically super specific plans. You decide in advance exactly how you'll respond to certain cues.
So instead of, I want to exercise more,
right? Instead of that vague goal you'd write down, on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 6 p.m., I will go to the gym on my way home from work and run for 30 minutes.
Ah, much more concrete.
Much more. This pre-planning helps automate the behavior, reducing the willpower needed in the moment to actually do it. The rehab booklet example showed patients with detailed plans, even for small things, had better recovery outcomes.
It's like writing a script for yourself beforehand so you don't have to rely purely on willpower when the trigger hits.
Exactly. And the Starbucks willpower experiment, comparing the coddled versus ordered employee groups, adds another layer.
Tell us about that one.
Well, Starbucks wanted baristas to handle stressful customer interactions better, more consistently. They found that just ordering employees don't get angry wasn't very effective.
Yeah, I can imagine.
What worked better was giving employees a sense of autonomy, explaining the why behind the desired behavior, and empowering them to problem solve.
So treating them like partners rather than just order takers?
Right. Fostering that sense of ownership seemed to boost their self-control and resilience in tough situations, more than just strict rules did. It tapped into a deeper motivation than just sheer willpower.
That makes intuitive sense. Okay, so we've talked a lot about individual habits, but the sources also looked at how habits operate in larger systems like organizations, even whole societies.
Yes, organizational routines, much like our personal habits, create stability, predictability, even efficiency.
Yeah.
They can foster these unspoken truces between groups, like the salespeople limiting discounts example. It helps things run smoothly despite underlying tensions.
But when those routines get too rigid or communication breaks down, the results can be truly disastrous. The King's Crossfire is just a tragic example.
It really is. The ingrained routines in the London Underground, the strict separation of duties, the reluctance to even say fire between departments, no clear protocol for escalating alarms. It all contributed to a fatally slow response. Even when the signs were there, the existing habits and communication norms prevented swift action. It shows how embedded routines can blind us.
But on the flip side, it seems like major crises can sometimes force positive change, like they disrupt old habits. The Rhode Island hospital case after the wrong site surgery.
Exactly. That profound shock, the intense public scrutiny, it created this undeniable sense of crisis. It made everyone far more open to change.
So things that were resisted before.
Things like surgical checklists, mandatory timeouts before operating, they were finally implemented effectively. And it led to a significant lasting drop in medical errors. It shows how a huge disruption can create an opening for safer, better practices.
Almost like hitting a reset button. Now, the sources also touched on how understanding habits is key to influencing consumers, shifting norms. The example of trying to get Americans to eat organ meat during World War II was, well, kind of fascinating.
It was. To overcome the aversion to things like liver and kidneys during wartime shortages, the Committee on Food Habits was smart. They realized you had to make the unfamiliar more familiar. Their strategy was basically camouflage. Provide recipes that snuck liver into familiar dishes like meatloaf. Emphasize familiar ways of cooking and serving. It was a gradual approach, respecting existing habits while introducing the new food gently. And it actually worked, at least temporarily.
And then the music industry example with Hey Ya, how radio stations had to carefully introduce it.
Exactly. Even with data predicting trends, something truly novel often needs that period of familiarization. Listeners' ears have habits too.
Huh. Never thought of it that way.
Radio stations mix Hey Ya with more mainstream songs, gradually exposing people, making its unique sound acceptable, and eventually hugely popular. It's about nudging existing habits, not forcing a total break.
And Target using all that data to predict habits, especially the pregnancy prediction story that really highlights the power here.
For sure. Target's analysis let them identify likely pregnant customers and send targeted coupons right when purchasing habits were changing significantly. It shows the immense power of understanding and even predicting habits for marketing, tapping into emerging needs.
And finally, the Montgomery bus boycott. It shows how social habits, friendships, weaker social ties can fuel massive social movements.
Rosa Parks' act was the spark, absolutely. But it was the deeply embedded social habits in the Black community that sustained the boycott.
How so?
Strong friendships motivated people who knew Parks to act and spread the word. And then the power of weak ties, those broader network connections created widespread social pressure and solidarity, became hard not to join. The movement worked because it tapped into and leveraged these existing social networks and our fundamental desire for community.
It's amazing how these small social connections can fuel something so huge. Okay, as we start to wrap up this really fascinating discussion, what are some practical steps, things you, our listener, can do right now to get more aware of your own habits?
Well, the very first step is just cultivating conscious awareness. Start paying deliberate attention to your daily routines, those things you do on autopilot.
Mm,
When you feel that urge for a habit, try to pause. Identify the cue. Ask yourself, what just happened? What time is it? Where am I? What was I feeling right before this?
so become a detective of your own behavior, basically, noticing the signals.
Exactly. Then, once you spot the cue, consciously observe the routine. What is the actual behavior? Be specific. And finally, try to nail down the reward. What craving is being satisfied? Is it physical, emotional release, distraction, accomplishment, social connection?
And the sources suggested that reward isn't always obvious, right? Sometimes you have to experiment a bit.
Yes, definitely. When the urge hits, try substituting a different reward. If you usually grab a sugary snack mid-afternoon, maybe try a quick walk and chat with a colleague instead. Or just a glass of water.
Try different things to see what satisfies the underlying craving.
Precisely. Experimenting helps isolate what your brain is really after. And a really helpful practice, write it down. Write down the cue, the routine, your best guess at the reward. Making those unconscious patterns tangible makes them much easier to analyze.
This has been such an incredibly insightful deep dive into the science of habit. So, just to recap some key takeaways for you, our listener.
Yeah, we've explored how habits are these powerful neurological loops, right? Cue, routine, reward. Understanding those components is the crucial first step to changing them.
Hmm.
We've also learned about the huge influence of keystone habits, how they can spark broader positive changes.
Right, the domino effect.
Exactly. And the golden rule.
Hmm.
You can't just eliminate bad habits. You have to change them by swapping the routine but keeping the cue and reward.
And willpower. It's like a muscle, finite but strengthenable, and you can use planning those implementation intentions to manage it better.
Right. And finally, we saw how these principles apply not just to us as individuals, but also shape organizations and even societal trends.
And the personal significance of all this is just huge. Grasping these principles really gives you, our listener, a powerful toolkit. You can understand and take control of those automatic behaviors, maybe the ones holding you back, and consciously build new habits that line up with your goals.
Which leads to a really important question for you to think about. Now that you have this deeper understanding, what's maybe one small, seemingly tiny change you could make this week? Something that might create an unexpected ripple effect in your life.
Good question.
Or maybe think about an organization or community you're part of. What are some of those unspoken routines, those habits that subtly shape its culture and behavior? For better, or maybe for worse.
Some truly compelling food for thought there. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We really hope these insights empower you to better understand and navigate the often unseen but incredibly powerful world of your own habits.